restructure these 27 billion, which were payable in the next 2 years. I'm going to delay payment by 40 years. Now, why was this important? 27 billion is not that much money for the Central Bank of Europe, but legally it was it was a nuclear weapon. The reason is this. The only reason why the euro survives today is quantitative easing. The fact that Draghi, since March 2015, has been printing anything between 60 and 80 billion a month, purchasing bonds and other kinds of debt. Now, you may recall that Jens Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank, was adamant against QE and its precursor, the so-called OMT program. So much so that he personally, representing of course the Bundesbank, took the European Central Bank to the Constitutional Court of Germany in Karlsruhe and asked the constitutional judges to deem these bond purchases by the ECB illegal and in violation of the German constitution. This is a very big charge. Jens Weidmann submitted 121 pages of a deposition signed by himself against this. Now, of course, the judges did what the judges do in these circumstances. They decided not to decide because it's just too difficult for them to make this decision. So they referred the matter to the European Court. And the European courts asked, summoned Mr. Draghi, who appeared in front of the judges, and won the case against Weidmann and Bundesbank on the basis of a pledge. And the pledge was that he would not allow any restructuring of any of the bonds owned by the ECB. This is why restructuring the 27 billion of Greek bonds, which were written in Greek law, which, in other words, all he needed was a signature from me in order to restructure them unilaterally, that would have blown up the QE program that kept the euro together. This was a nuclear weapon that we had. I never wanted to use any weapons against Europe. But if they closed down my banks, I think it was completely legitimate to say that 27 billion, well, you can't have it. So that was one part of the deterrent.
And in the end, you were not allowed to use this weapon?
Yes. But we had the only reason why I accepted the ministry was because we shook hands with Alexis Tsipras and the leading team of Syriza that it makes no sense for us to get elected. This is going along with the gist of your question. Just with good arguments and the power of persuasion, you're not going to get anywhere. There's a whole wall of denial in the Eurogroup and in the Troika. But if you have the nuclear weapon as well, the doomsday machine, if you want to call it that, then they will come to the table. And I have no doubt that they would have come to the table. Unfortunately, this is where disunity brings defeat. Our government was disunited, and members of the team signaled to Draghi, don't worry about Varoufakis, we're not going to let him haircut those bonds. And from that moment onwards, defeat was
But before that, you were convinced that Draghi would never let this happen?
I still am convinced he would not let it happen if I was allowed to do that. It was only when Draghi realized that we were not united in government and I would have had the rug pulled from under my feet that he closed the banks.
So the Greek finance minister now says that there will be negotiations about debt relief.
You know what? We've been doing this now for 7 years.
Yeah.
For 7 years I hear the same inanity. For 7 years we keep taking loans on the basis that sometime in the distant future there's going to be a debt restructure. There's no doubt that there's going to be a debt restructure. An unpayable debt does not get paid. It's really very simple. It's not a question of willpower, it's not a question of ethics, it's not in the Bible. It will not be repaid. If you're bankrupt, you cannot repay your debt, full stop. So you need a debt restructure. The only question of interest is the debt restructure going to come first, and therefore giving an opportunity to the Greek economy to recover with a reduction in tax rates, reduction in the budget surplus targets and so on and so forth, which is necessary to attract investment? Or is the patient going to die, Greece going to be Kosovized, as I say, turned into a desert, with all its young people having left, becoming an old folks' home, and then of course at the end they will cut the debt because, once the place is derelict, they will cut the debt. That's it. Now, unfortunately, my good friend Euclid, who succeeded me in the ministry, whom I know agrees entirely with every word that I just said to you, and I am prepared to testify for this in any court of law or any forum. For some reason, I cannot explain, is now adopting the language of the Troika and of the lenders who say, oh, well, you take more loans now and you impose more austerity and you shrink your incomes more and one day we'll restructure your debt.
See.
Well, no sensible person believes it on this planet. And I can assure you that Euclid Tsakalotos, who is saying this now in the Ministry of Finance, doesn't believe it either. I've known him for 30 years, he doesn't believe it.
So IMF becoming increasingly critical of how it acts.
So you see the IMF doesn't believe it?
No, yes. Do you think IMF will leave the Greek program?
No.
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 Why not?
The IMF is in a right old mess, unfortunately, for a very long time now. The leadership of the IMF, which is usually European, don't really care about the IMF. They're interested in their own political careers in the future in Europe. And therefore they're utilizing the IMF against the interests of the international community that should be using the IMF for good reasons, for good causes.
Because that's how you explain the IMF's involvement in the beginning with Dominic Strauss-Kahn caring about his political career in France.
Listen, whenever I have a choice between explaining something on the basis of stupidity or self-interest, I opt for the self-interest explanation. Dominic Strauss-Kahn was a very smart man. So why did he push the IMF into a program that violated the principles of the IMF? Not because he couldn't see what he was doing, but because he wanted to be president of France. And to be president of France, he had to save the French banks from their own folly. And this is what happened.
So what about you? Didn't you make any mistakes?
Of course I made.
We're all prone to stupidity and self-interest.
I made
What was your biggest mistake during these 5 months?
two large ones.
Yeah.
First one is that I accepted, without too much criticism, the policy, the strategy of keeping our negotiating tactics under wraps. Everything I've been telling you now about the haircutting of the S&P bonds and all that, this was not something that we brought out. There was a good reason for that, or a semi-good reason, that by the time we got elected, there was already a bank run. So talking about haircutting the S&P bonds of the ECB, that would have sped up the bank run. But with the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake not to share this strategy, this vision of the strategy, with the peoples of Europe. Not just the people of Greece, but the peoples of Europe. That's one big mistake. Because in the end, I always believed in transparency, now I believe in transparency even more. Whenever you want to do something, your voters should know what it is that you're trying to do. Not only what your objective is, but what your means are as well. And this is where Theresa May here in Britain is very badly mistaken, to keep her cards close to her chest. The second mistake I made was to sign the application for the extension of the loan agreement towards the end of February. We had a good agreement on the 20th of February in the Eurogroup, 20th of February, where Greece, our government, would be assessed on the basis of our own agenda regarding reforms. Then a few days later, the Troika took this back and they turned us back to the old failed program, at least verbally. I should have said to them, well, since you are violating the spirit and the letter of the 20th February agreement, I'm not signing this extension of the loan agreement. I hoped that our government would remain united and we would simply be buying time to give the creditors more of an opportunity to honor that 20th February agreement. I was wrong, I should not have signed it, and that would have meant that the bank closures would have come towards the end of February, towards the end of June, and one way or the other there would have been a resolution much earlier.
So you're mentioning there was already a bank run when you got elected, because some people will say that Greece was recovering in 2014 and it was only kind of you coming in and picking a fight with the creditors that then sort of made the problems worse again.
But I can say that the earth is flat, it's just as credible.
Okay.
Greece was fading. It's been fading since 2008. Just go to any data bank and look at Greek GDP, nominal GDP in euros. And you see that it fell in 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. Every year it fell. What happened was, it was a real GDP growth in 2014. But you know why? Because real GDP, as you know, is a ratio. GDP in euros, nominal GDP, divided by an index of prices. What happened in 2014 was the prices were falling faster than incomes. And therefore, the ratio was going up because the denominator was falling faster than the numerator. But that is not a sign of recovery. that is a sign of a huge depression. When prices fall faster than incomes after 6 years of a decline in incomes, you are in the depths of depression. To have the international press saying, oh, Greece was recovering when these people walked into government, this is just absurd. And you know what? It's also offensive to the Greek people. The Greek people didn't want to elect us. They did not suddenly become left-wing. I mean, we were a party of 4%, and then we went to 40%. Why did that happen? Because the Greeks could see that nothing was working. The people of Greece are much wiser than foreign correspondents, except, of course, you.
Of course.
They chose us because what we said made sense, and there was no recovery. The recovery was Greek recovery, as they used to call it, the Greek success story, was just adding insult to the injury of the Greeks.
So who's the bad guy in this story? Because you are quite understanding. You get along with George Osborne, the British finance minister, even Wolfgang Schäuble, who was portrayed in the media as your arch enemy. You know, towards the end of the book, you get along, or sort of you have good discussions. Who's the bad guy?
No one.
No one.
I tried to write this book with a humanist perspective. When you watch an ancient Greek tragedy, Oedipus, who is the bad guy? There are no bad guys. Well, there are no bad guys. Everybody is trying to do their best, but that's the whole structure of a tragedy. The game is set up in such a way that even though everybody is trying to do their best, in the end everybody is contributing to a disaster.
So how do you change?
This was exactly how I tried to write this book. I have no doubt that Wolfgang Schäuble was trying to do his best. Christine Lagarde was trying to do her best. My Prime Minister was trying to do his best. But in the end, the game we play in Europe is bringing out the worst possible outcome for our people. And even powerful men like Wolfgang Schäuble, or women like Angela Merkel, in the end, they are caught in the trap of their own power and end up powerless. This is the stuff of true tragedy.
So how do you change Europe from being the stuff of true tragedy to something else?
By democratizing it.
Democratizing.
You see, democracy is not a luxury for the creditors. It's not something that's nice to have. The reason why democracy evolved, never perfectly and nowhere perfectly, is because it's the only way of managing a crisis. You see, during the good times, you don't need democracy. You can have a cartel structure like Europe always did. Europe is a cartel, really, of